At 89, Sonia Segal sat by the window of her small Los Angeles home, the soft light of a California morning spilling across the room. On the table beside her rested a faded photograph. George, smiling in that familiar way that made everyone feel like he was in on a secret. It had been years since his passing, but that smile still haunted her. She'd been silent about his final words for so long, protecting them like something sacred. But now, with the years catching up to her and her heart no longer burdened by fear or fame, she decided it was time to tell the truth about George Segal's final confession. George had always been full of contradictions. To the world, he was the charming actor, the handsome, quick-witted man who could make a joke out of anything. From Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to the Goldbergs, he brought warmth and humor to every role. But behind closed doors, there was a restlessness in him, a quiet sorrow that only those closest to him could see. Sonia had learned to live beside it, to love him through the storms and silences. He carried the weight of being loved, she often said. It sounds beautiful, but it can be exhausting. Their life together had been a mosaic of laughter, art, and regret. George loved deeply but imperfectly. Fame had shaped him, not cruelly, but with a subtle erosion that wore away at his peace. He was grateful for the career, the accolades, the fans who adored him. But he was never sure if people loved him or the version of him that appeared on screen. As the years passed, the line between the two blurred. Sonia had been there through his marriages, his reinventions, and finally, through the quiet twilight of his later years, when the world had started to forget. It was in those last months that his charm softened into something more fragile. He had grown quieter, spending more time in his study surrounded by old scripts and photographs. Some days he would sit and reread letters from directors, co-stars, or fans, reminders of a world that had once revolved around him. Other days he would stare out the window lost in thought. Sonia knew he was remembering things he never said out loud. One evening, when the sunset painted the sky in streaks of gold and rose, George called her into the room. His voice was faint but steady. "Sonia," he said, "there's something I need to tell you before I go." She sat beside him, her hand resting on his. He smiled faintly. "You remember how everyone said I was lucky? Lucky to work so long, to have a family, to have you." She nodded. "Well," he said, pausing for breath, "the truth is, I didn't always feel lucky. I spent so much of my life pretending I was happy that I forgot how to actually be happy." Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. He continued, his voice shaking slightly. "All the roles, all the charm, they were armor. People loved George Segal, the character, but I don't think anyone really knew George, the man." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Except you. You saw through it and you stayed anyway. I think that's the only real thing I ever had." Sonia remembered how after that he fell asleep holding her hand. He woke again hours later, weaker, and whispered something else, something she hadn't shared with anyone until now. "If you ever tell them anything about me," he said softly, "tell them I wasn't acting when I laughed with you. That was the only time it was real." Those were the last words he ever spoke. For years after his death, journalists asked her about his final moments. She always smiled politely, deflecting with grace. "He was peaceful," she'd say. "He was ready." But she never repeated those words, not out of shame, but because they felt too precious, too private. She wanted to keep something of him that wasn't for the world to dissect. But time changes things. When you reach 89, you start to see memory differently. You realize that silence can sometimes distort truth just as much as gossip can. So when a journalist visited her for a retrospective piece on George's legacy, Sonia finally spoke. "He confessed that he wasn't always as happy as he seemed," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But he also said that the laughter he shared with me, and with his audience, was real. Even when he was hurting, he still found joy in making people smile. That was his gift." The confession spread quietly at first, a brief quote in a feature story. But soon it began circulating widely. Fans shared it online, touched by the vulnerability behind the man they'd loved for so long. "He made us happy even when he wasn't," one fan wrote. "That's what makes him unforgettable." Others revisited his old films, looking for glimpses of the truth he'd hidden, the flicker of sadness behind the smile, the way he could make humor feel like heartache and heartache feel like love. For Sonia, the confession was a release. She hadn't revealed it for attention or sentimentality, but to remind people that behind every charming face is a complicated soul. "George wasn't perfect," she said later in another interview, He was human. He doubted himself. He regretted things, but he also loved life more deeply than anyone I've ever known. Even when he didn't feel lucky, he still tried to make others feel that they were. In the years that followed, George Segal's legacy softened into something even more meaningful. He was remembered not just as a beloved actor, but as a man who dared to be vulnerable, even in his final breath. Younger actors began quoting him in interviews, saying his honesty inspired them to stop pretending they had it all together. Fans began leaving letters at his old star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, thanking him not for perfection, but for authenticity. And every now and then, Sonia would visit that star, quietly brushing away the dust, smiling to herself. She didn't feel lonely anymore. She felt connected. To him, to the laughter he left behind, to the world that still remembered. Late one evening, sitting by that same window, she looked again at the old photograph. "You were wrong, George," she whispered. "People did know you. They just didn't know how much they did." Outside, the Los Angeles night shimmered with city lights, and for a moment she swore she could hear his laughter again. Soft, genuine, and finally at peace.